Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. What the first wave of US-Iran sanctions means for Iranians and companies doing business there. Also this week, big oil and climate change. What are the world's largest oil companies failing to reveal about the future of fossil fuels? Plus, the economic stakes in the Saudi-Canada spat. So, a first round of US economic sanctions on Iran was slapped back into place this week. They're being reimposed because US President Donald Trump walked away from the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. A second round of US sanctions targeting the country's oil and gas industry will hit in November. We'll have a report from Zain Basravi on what impact sanctions are having inside Iran in just a few moments. But first, Patty Culhane reports from Washington on what the US wants to achieve by reimposing penalties.
The U.S. plan when it comes to Iran hurt the economy, hurt the people, forced the government to agree to change much of its foreign policy.
The policy is not regime change, but we definitely want to put maximum pressure on the government. And it's not just to come back to discuss fixing a deal that's basically not fixable, dealing with the nuclear weapons aspect. We want to see a much broader retreat by Iran from their support for international terrorism, their belligerent military activity in the Middle East, and their ballistic missile nuclear-related programs.
All things Iran is unlikely to agree to. Still, the partners in the nuclear deal are urging dialogue.
We really just encourage the United States to start talking to its partners in Iran in order to be able to find a route forward.
The European Union is trying to protect its companies, taking the unusual step of issuing a blocking statement. That says European companies should ignore U.S. sanctions. But still, car companies, drug manufacturers, and many other big names are leaving Iran. The reason, if a company does business in the United States and then chooses to do business in Iran, well, the U.S. government can basically cut them out of the U.S. market. That is a much more important economic one. Government officials here say they will be watching closely, and they plan to aggressively enforce the sanctions that have been put in place. Still, the U.S. is going this alone. Unlike last time, the other major economies like China are vowing to continue to do business with Iran. And even though they technically will not be able to use the U.S. dollar, the world's currency, former State Department official Jared Blanc says they will find a way to work around that, and that will hurt the U.S. in the long term.
The world's banking system is like a sewer, and all of the plumbing runs to New York. There's no law of physics, there's no law of laws that says that has to be true. It's just the way things have developed since World War II. Right now, you've got the EU, which is, their economy is as large as ours. You've got China growing to the point that they will soon be larger than us. And if we abuse the power that we get from that central role, if we capriciously apply sanctions without taking into account the national security concerns of our closest allies and partners, we're going to lose that position.
The Trump administration is betting the power of the U.S. dollar is key to all economic growth all around the world. Iran hoping that by the U.S. going it alone, that will no longer be the case.
At the edge of the country, where Iran meets Iraq, human mules have carried smuggled goods across the border for years. Rugged routes like this one in Kurdistan province import electronics, phones, beauty products, medicine, cigarettes. The list goes on. It's dangerous work as smugglers evade taxes and custom duties. The illegal trade represents a fraction of Iranian imports. But with more U.S. sanctions imposed, the government is cracking down on the groups controlling these routes.
Iran has land and naval borders with 15 countries. We could never close all the borders. For 70 to 80 years now, local people have been trading with neighboring countries. In the last 2 decades, demands in the country have risen and the scale of the border trade has increased. If you associate it to sanctions, our government is against it and has made many obstacles for local people that are involved in it.
Iranian leaders are keen to stop illegal imports and promote made-in-Iran goods. It's part of an ongoing policy from the supreme leader himself to develop domestic production and become self-reliant in the face of American economic pressure. Despite financial struggle, Iranian consumers care about quality and want name brands. Some turn to second-hand markets to stay in fashion on a budget. Others are buying up gold and, ironically, American dollars to keep their savings safe from the impact of American sanctions. things such as tires are being replaced only after being driven down to the rims. And with the rising cost of replacement, recycling is squeezing a little more mileage out of the stuff of life. Hussein Afshar has restored old furniture for years. He says he's part artist, part handyman, and his customers with an eye for quality can be unforgiving.
People want to keep the originality of the work because nothing new can replace something old. Another issue is high prices. Many products are not made or imported anymore, so people prefer to keep things. It is about the cost. In Iran, price is the main issue.
The economic pressure has provoked more street protests recently, but in a small corner shop in the capital, art is being born out of necessity.
Well, joining me now from Stuttgart is Andreas Schweitzer, Managing Director and co-founder of UK-based Argen Capital. Since 2009, he's been advising international companies targeting the Iranian market. Thanks very much for being with us. So Donald Trump has said that these are, in his words, the most biting sanctions ever. Many of us will say that this is the kind of bluster that we've come to expect from the US president. But just how hard will these sanctions hit the Iranian economy?
This is certainly, one should take President Trump by his word that he intends what he is doing here. And you see the damage it's already doing to the Iranian economy. The rial has devalued dramatically, which is not only a factor of the sanction, but also the way the government has, or central bank has handled the foreign exchange situation. They're trying to get this back under control in order to improve the value. You have high unemployment, you have companies leaving, so the morale is quite bad, and the economy also.
President Trump has also warned that anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States. Who's he talking to here? China, the European Union? And if he is, would they risk their own economies by defying the US?
I would say his comments are probably more addressed to the Europeans, because the Chinese are more independent to the sanction issue. They will continue to buy oil, India as well. Turkey makes noises saying they will stick to their own mission themselves. So Turkey probably could suffer from US sanction, but definitely European companies have a lot at stake in the US. Look at what Daimler-Benz said. They are retracting. Scania is not delivering buses and lorries. So the issue is with Europe again.
So what do you expect the Europeans to do? I mean, if you were advising them, what would you be telling them at this point?
We are invested in this area, and we advise company in the whole area. But definitely you have those who decide to leave because they are very strong in Europe. Take companies like Siemens or other big companies who very much depend on the US market. No question for them to leave. Then you have those who are probably less exposed. They will try to stay, and they do stay. And you have others who see this as an opportunity, who have no US exposure, and to do an M&A transaction and to buy businesses in Iran. Much depends what is your exposure to the US economy. If you don't have any, Iran is an opportunity. If you have a lot of exposure to the US, your Iran exposure can be a problem indeed.
Or Iran is already reacting to this. They've put in place emergency measures to stop the collapse of its currency, which has slumped to record lows against the US dollar since the start of the year. What impact is that having? Is it working?
It's a bit early to say. They started that on Monday, but certainly, I mean, as we all know, you can't stem against the market, and Iran was trying to stem against the forex market, and by not allowing foreign exchange to happen, you create a panic. The rial has plumped to a third of its value, and now by allowing foreign exchange offices again and releasing the subsidized rate, they try to bring the official rate and the market rate closer together. So we believe that this will work, because at the moment, at this rate, the country can't even import anything. It's just prohibitively expensive. So what the Americans haven't done, the Iranians have been quite efficient doing it themselves. So they hopefully can repair and undo what they have done so far.
And this is only the first wave of sanctions against Iran, US sanctions against Iran, we're being told. There's going to be a second wave in November, which is targeting Iran's oil exports. And of course, Iran is, oil rather, is a big part of Iran's economy. What effect is that going to have?
I mean, that is the bet President Trump is having. He wants to bring that oil export to nil, which is probably not happening. As I mentioned, the Chinese will buy, the Indians will buy, and these are already very large buyers. Then waivers will probably not happen. They haven't happened in the past, and I don't see why they would happen now. The situation will be back to where we were in 2010, 2012. So the Iranians have to adjust again to the same measures they have taken then. And the Iranians are also rather well trained in handling sanctions.
Andrea Streitzer, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, sir.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost, a pledge to stamp out Colombia's cocaine addiction. But first, the Turkish lira has hit an all-time low versus the dollar. Concerns about worsening relations with the US sparked the latest sell-off. The currency has lost more than 1/3 of its value this year. Analysts say concerns are growing as well that repayments on foreign loans won't be made. Fitch credit rating agency said Friday it is watching developments. Now, relations between Saudi Arabia and Canada soured dramatically this week. Canada's foreign ministry had called for the release of a Saudi women's rights activist with family in Canada in a tweet. Saudi Arabia immediately withdrew its ambassador and ordered students and medical patients to leave Canada too. Initially, it was unclear how the dispute would affect the annual Saudi-Canadian trade of nearly $4 billion. But on Thursday, Saudi officials were quoted as saying oil sales to Canadian customers will not be affected. The future of a $13 billion defense contract agreed by the previous Canadian administration still hangs in the balance. Saudi Arabia is also reportedly selling Canadian equities and bonds. Kristen Salumi has more now from Toronto.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had no apology for his government's call to release 2 human rights activists being detained in Saudi Arabia.
Canadians have always expected our government to speak strongly, firmly, clearly and politely about the need to respect human rights at home and around the world. We will continue to do that.
Trudeau promised to continue to engage with the Saudis and their allies, but the Saudi foreign minister wasn't having any of it. He accused Canada of intervening in what he described as a national security issue, claiming that the activists had attempted to get sensitive government information.
There is no need for mediation. Canada made a big mistake and has to fix it. Canada fully understands what is required from it. Mediation is when there are 2 parties who have demands. In this situation, the mistake has been made by only one party. It was Canada who intervened. This mistake has to be corrected.
The value of the Canadian dollar fell on news the Saudis would divest from Canadian stocks and bonds. Experts predict the overall impact on the economy from this and other measures will be small, but the message is being heard far beyond Canada's borders.
Ultimately, this really is not about Canada per se. Canada here is collateral damage, if you will, or it's incidental to this issue. Saudi Arabia is trying to send a very strong and clear message to Western countries, to Europeans in particular: do not criticize us on human rights or you will be penalized.
Middle East expert Besma Momani believes domestic Saudi issues are at play.
I think this has more to do with a very useful diversion. It's an attempt to make Canada a case, signal to the world that it's not going to accept international criticism, particularly Western criticism of its domestic policies. And I think the Chile effect has worked, because we have seen pretty much no Western European country, including the United States as well, in terms of supporting Canada. So it really has had the chill effect on the international Western world.
It's hard to gauge how Saudi nationals here in Canada feel about being forced to leave the country because many are reluctant to speak. But we do know that hundreds of Canadian Muslims who are leaving this week to attend the Hajj in Saudi Arabia are worried about how they're going to get home. Saudi Airline are suspending flights in and out of the country next week, but have promised to find passenger seats on other airlines. But so far, no sign the Saudis and the Canadians are coming together to resolve this dispute.
Tesla's CEO wants to buy out the electric car maker and end public trading of the company. Elon Musk said on Twitter that he had secured funding to buy all of the firm's stocks. A buyout at today's prices would cost more than $70 billion. Musk could face criminal penalties for breaking stock market rules if it turns out he doesn't have the money. The announcement followed a Financial Times report saying Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund had bought a large stake in Tesla. Now, investors and shareholders are beginning to ask how concerned the world's biggest oil companies are about climate change. Oil companies have known about climate change for a long time, but they plan on only reducing carbon emissions towards the second half of this century. Activists want big oil companies to model and commit to more rapid emissions reductions. This week, UK asset manager Saracen and Partners asked BP, Shell and Total to reveal the risk they face if carbon emission targets are met. Rules to limit greenhouse gas emissions could force fossil fuel companies to keep oil, natural gas and coal in the ground. The International Energy Agency forecasts that by 2040, demand for oil and gas could fall by almost 50%. But that's only if carbon emissions reductions targets are met. Royal Dutch Shell has acknowledged that climate change will be the defining challenge facing the oil industry for years to come. But Total and Shell and others are still expecting strong demand for fossil fuels for the next few decades. ExxonMobil is under investigation over its financial disclosures on climate change. Well, joining me now from London is Anthony Hobley, CEO of Carbon Tracker, a financial think tank. Thanks very much for being with us. So what are the oil companies not telling us then?
Well, I think they're being a bit schizophrenic. They are looking at climate risk, and we're now being deluged with disclosure and scenario analysis from the companies, effectively stress testing their business models against a Paris-compliant 2 degrees pathway. But then when they talk to investors, they're still talking up demand. And what we're seeing a range of disclosure that tells us every single energy company, oil and gas company, is a winner. And that simply can't be possible. Yes, some of them may well do well in the transition, but not all of them. So there will be winners and losers. And at the moment, it's very difficult to discern who the winners will be and who the losers will be in this transition.
Are they essentially putting their business survival ahead of survival of the planet?
They are still, I think, psychologically wedded to the idea that it's cyclical, that we're still going to see rises and drops in oil price rather than a structural change. Our analysis and our work is telling us that we've entered a phase of transition where, it's no longer about peak oil, but it's about peak demand. Fossil fuels is no longer the only game in town. They're now having to compete with the new kids on the block, which is clean energy. And as clean energy goes up the learning curve and effectively is now in the exponential part of the S-curve, we're seeing dramatic drops in price of solar, wind, batteries and electric vehicles. And that is eating into demand for the incumbent's product, oil, gas and coal. Combined also with dramatic steps forward in energy efficiency, which whilst global energy demand is growing, that is being offset dramatically by advances in energy efficiency. So, global energy demand is now only growing at 1%. And what's really interesting is increasingly the new technologies have the lion's share of that growth.
Should regulators be taking a closer look at some of these big oil companies then?
Well, they are. We now have the G20 initiated a whole process with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. That's made its recommendations. The problem with that is it's still voluntary. Regulators are still trying to understand, if and how they translate that into their national regulatory regimes. And it's still a case of apples and pears. I mean, we haven't got a consistent approach to that valuation and how companies assess their business models against future prices. So I think regulators have a role to play here in ensuring that there is a robust and comparable regime for comparing this risk and getting companies to say how are they positioned to deal with this transition risk and with a transition to a low carbon or a net zero economy.
So which companies are the worst offenders here when it comes to turning a blind eye to their business model?
We did a report, 2 Degrees of Separation, where we ranked companies by reference to their exposure to climate risk, and some are more exposed than others. You tend to find the oil and gas majors somewhere in the middle, but it wouldn't surprise you that we see the US companies probably is the most exposed within that sort of group of majors. And I think the European companies and some of the sort of Asian companies are getting out there, at least in trying to assess this risk and develop their disclosures. But I mean, nobody, I think, yet is getting an A+ here. There's a lot of work to do to get effectively decision-useful disclosure out of these companies.
Anthony Hobley, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, Colombia's youngest president, Iván Duque, marked his inauguration on Tuesday with a pledge to permanently eradicate coca cultivation. The UN's Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that 866 tons of cocaine was produced at secret labs across Colombia in 2016. The coca crops cover 146,000 hectares of land, mostly in isolated regions where there's little government control. The UN believes 106,000 families live off coca production as their main source of income. Demand for the drug comes primarily from the United States and Europe. Al Jazeera's Manuel Rapallo has more now from Toribio, Colombia.
In the mountains of western Colombia, plantations of illicit crops checker the landscape. For individuals harvesting coca or marijuana, as in the case of Ovidio Yule, there's no legal crop that will bring in as much money.
We are expecting to make between $11,000 and $14,000 if the price is in our favor. The price is unpredictable like the weather.
Over the last 3 years, cultivation of illicit crops has skyrocketed in this region. Many believe that the issue has already grown out of the control of the national government. Colombian President Iván Duque has called illicit crop cultivations like this marijuana field with somewhere around 2,000 plants on it an existential threat and has vowed to increase eradication efforts, including a crop substitution program for rural farmers. The new president has also announced a policy that includes the deployment of unmanned drones to spray illicit crops with the chemical herbicide glyphosate.
They are either naive or they think we are all just stupid enough to believe that drones will defeat the phenomenon of drug trafficking.
This is Alexander Lopez. He's a Colombian senator and a critic of the proposed eradication efforts.
The only way to stop drug trafficking is for farmers and people in these regions where illicit crops are grown to be aided by the government and for the government to have their backs.
Towns like Toribio exist at the fringe of the government's control. Business owners like Juan Carlos say without government support, marijuana cultivation has become an important part of the community.
By cultivating and commercializing, there's now money that in one way or another moves the local economy. That's the impact I've seen.
Marijuana farmers like Ovidio say they're concerned about the future, worried that the new government will send soldiers to destroy their plants, removing their only source of income.
And that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at Hazem Seeker and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online as well at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.